The Kremlin is navigating its most precarious moment in decades, as mounting evidence suggests Vladimir Putin's once iron grip on power is weakening under the combined weight of economic collapse, military stalemate, and growing public exhaustion with a war that has now entered its fourth year. While overt mass protests remain absent from Russia's streets, the indicators of systemic stress are multiplying across every sector of Russian society and governance. From the front lines of Ukraine to the frozen towns of Western Russia, from elite circles in Moscow to the oil fields of Siberia, the foundations of Putin's system are showing signs of critical strain. The question no longer is whether the regime faces pressure, but whether that pressure has reached a tipping point that could precipitate fundamental political change. What is happening across Russia is a slow-motion unraveling rather than a sudden collapse, but the cumulative effect is increasingly difficult for the Kremlin to manage. Public opinion data from the independent Levada Center reveals a population deeply weary of conflict, yet paradoxically hardened in its opposition to compromise. Support for peace negotiations remains higher than support for continued fighting, with 61% of Russians favoring talks over military escalation as of January 2026. However, this represents a significant decline from December 2025, when 66% backed negotiations. More tellingly, if peace talks fail, 59% of Russians say they would support intensifying military attacks rather than making concessions to Ukraine. This hardening attitude reflects both the effectiveness of state propaganda and a genuine societal conviction that Russia cannot afford to lose. The economic picture is equally dire and increasingly impossible to conceal. Russia's fossil fuel export revenues have dropped to their lowest levels since the full-scale invasion began, falling to approximately €464 million per day in January 2026. This represents not just a marginal decline, but a structural shift in Russia's ability to finance its war machine. Oil and gas revenues, which account for nearly a quarter of federal budget receipts, have been cut in half compared to previous years. The once celebrated resilience of the Russian economy, which weathered initial sanctions through rapid redirection of exports to China and India, is now showing fatal cracks. The military economy bubble that briefly boosted wages and industrial production in 2023 and 2024 has burst, leaving ordinary Russians facing empty wallets and rising prices. How this deterioration occurred is a story of cumulative pressure finally exceeding adaptive capacity. For years, Russia successfully circumvented Western sanctions by building a shadow fleet of aging tankers, offering deep discounts on crude, and finding willing buyers in Asia. That workaround is now failing. Indian imports of Russian crude, which reached approximately 1.7 million barrels per day last year, fell to about 1.1 million barrels per day in January 2026, with major refiners including Indian Oil, Bharat Petroleum, and Reliance Industries halting purchases entirely. The European Union's ban on imports of fuels refined from Russian crude, which took full effect in January 2026, has compounded the damage by closing a major loophole. Russian seaborne crude exports fell from 3.8 million barrels per day in December to 3.4 million in January and are tracking even lower in February. Meanwhile, the volume of Russian oil held on ships has climbed to a record high above 150 million barrels, a clear sign that buyers are disappearing. The consequences for Russia's war effort are immediate and severe. With storage facilities filling rapidly and onshore capacity estimated at only around 100 million barrels, including pipeline reserves, producers face few options beyond cutting output. Analysts at Rystad Energy project Russian oil production could fall by up to 300,000 barrels per day between March and May 2026 as logistical bottlenecks become insurmountable. Each barrel not sold is revenue not earned, and each revenue decline reduces the Kremlin's ability to fund military operations, pay soldiers, and maintain the social subsidies that have thus far preserved domestic quiescence. The global importance of Russia's internal deterioration cannot be overstated. A weakening Russia fundamentally alters the strategic calculus of every major power. For Ukraine and its Western allies, the prospect of Russian economic collapse presents both opportunity and danger. The opportunity lies in potentially forcing Moscow to accept terms far less favorable than it could have demanded even 6 months ago. While China continues to purchase Russian oil indeed, imports of Urals-grade crude doubled in January 2026 to their highest monthly volumes ever. It is also carefully calibrating its exposure. The European Union, despite sanctions, remains the largest buyer of Russian liquefied natural gas, accounting for nearly half of all LNG exports, a dependency that complicates any unified Western response. Historical context illuminates both the gravity and the limits of the current crisis. The Russian state has collapsed twice in the 20th century, in 1917 and 1991, and those precedents inevitably shape analysis of the present. However, most experts caution against direct comparisons. The Atlantic Council notes that while the Putin regime faces mounting pressure, there is currently little to indicate the country is close to repeating those historical implosions. The biggest single threat to autocratic stability comes from existing elites, and Putin has worked systematically to ensure no rival power bases can challenge him. Yet the absence of elite defection does not equal stability. Former Russian oil magnate and opposition figure Mikhail Khodorkovsky offers a sobering assessment of what change might look like. In a recent interview, he predicted that Russia will not see European-style democracy for at least another 20 years, even after Putin's departure. The transfer of power, he argues, would most likely occur only upon Putin's death, at which point Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin would constitutionally assume leadership. This would not bring stability, but rather ignite internal struggle between competing interest groups, security structures, and regional elites. Khodorkovsky emphasizes that real power in Russia is determined not by capital but by force, quoting the saying that gold buys everything, but weapons simply take everything. The political implications of this deteriorating situation extend far beyond the question of Putin's personal survival. The regime's ability to maintain control depends on a social contract that traded political submission for stability and gradually improving living standards. That contract is now broken. Opposition journalist Mikhail Fishman notes that throughout 2025 and into 2026, the majority of Russians have favored ending the war, with the only group remaining committed to continuation concentrated around Putin himself. Economic impact is now visible in granular detail across Russian industry and society. The defense sector continues to receive priority funding, but the civilian economy is left to freeze. Manufacturing is contracting, inflation is eroding purchasing power, and businesses are closing at rates significantly higher than before the war. The Russian government's interest payments on debt this year are projected to exceed combined spending on education and healthcare, a staggering indicator of fiscal distortion. The budget deficit is ballooning even as revenues contract, forcing the state to burn through reserves at unsustainable rates. Regional budgets are particularly strained, with deficits reaching approximately $21 billion and forcing cuts in services that directly affect ordinary Russians' daily lives. Social consequences are rippling through every community, though they manifest differently across regions and demographics. In Moscow, the war remains strangely invisible to many residents. 52% of Muscovites oppose negotiations, 21 points higher than the national average, and 61% feel the war has barely affected them personally. This insulation reflects both the capital's relative prosperity and its demographic transformation, as those who opposed the war have largely fled the country, while state officials and their families have concentrated in the city. But beyond the capital, the picture is starkly different. Families in provincial towns have lost sons and husbands. Communities struggle to absorb wounded veterans with minimal medical and psychological resources. The demographic impact is catastrophic, with a generation of young men decimated or disabled, creating social wounds that will fester for decades. The irony of Russian public opinion is that war fatigue coexists with hardened attitudes against compromise. Only 21% of Russians support lowering the Kremlin's maximum demands to end hostilities. This apparent contradiction stems from several factors. Denis Volkov, director of the Levada Center, explains that the prevailing opinion in society is that Putin intervened to protect Russian-speaking populations, a fundamental misunderstanding of the war's origins that propaganda has successfully entrenched. Additionally, the perception that Russian troops hold the initiative on the battlefield leads citizens to believe their government should not yield. Sociologist Vladimir Zvanovsky points to territory as a significant value in Russian consciousness, with geopolitical narratives emphasizing that more territory is better, meaning peace must involve growth rather than retreat. International reactions to Russia's internal decay are a study in cautious calculation. The United States, under President Trump, has tightened sanctions and imposed tariffs on India over its Russian oil purchases, directly pressuring Moscow's largest remaining customer. European powers continue to buy Russian LNG even as they rhetorically support Ukraine, creating tensions within the alliance. China watches with concern but continues trading, though it carefully avoids over-reliance on any single supplier. What could happen next is delineated by several observable pressure points. The first is oil revenue. If exports continue declining and storage fills completely, Russia will face an unavoidable production cut, directly reducing budget receipts and accelerating economic contraction. The second is elite cohesion. Reports of disagreements within the Kremlin over war economy management have emerged, with diverging opinions on financial policy and attracting international investment. While these differences have not yet translated into public splits, they indicate underlying tensions that could widen as pressure mounts. The third is public fatigue. Attention to the war within Russia has fallen to its lowest recorded level, with only 45% of respondents closely following events, a drop of 14 percentage points since May 2025. This disengagement could signal either resignation or a dangerous disconnect between population and state. The most significant unknown remains the military. The Russian army has suffered approximately 1.2 million casualties since February 2022, including up to 325,000 killed. These losses, unprecedented since World War II, permeate every community. The military's willingness to continue fighting indefinitely for a leader whose strategic vision grows increasingly murky is not guaranteed. Should frontline units begin refusing orders in significant numbers, or should officer corps discontent spread, the regime would face its most serious challenge since the Wagner mutiny, but with far less capacity to respond. The international community watches, with a mixture of hope and dread. A weakened Russia may be unable to sustain its war in Ukraine, potentially opening pathways to negotiation. But a collapsing Russia, armed with thousands of nuclear weapons and governed by a leadership facing existential threat, presents dangers that no contingency planning can fully address. The coming months will test whether the Putin system can adapt to pressures that have already broken its economic model, eroded its social contract, and exhausted its population. The answer to that test will determine not only Russia's future, but the shape of European security for decades to come. The erosion of Vladimir Putin's control is now visible in the most sensitive domain of Russian governance, the security services and military command structure. While public displays of dissent remain rare, behind the Kremlin's walls, a quiet but unmistakable recalibration is underway. The Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service reports that lawlessness, abuse of power, and crime are now widespread within the armed forces and posing a threat not only to military effectiveness but to Russian society and neighboring states alike. This is not the disciplined, ideologically committed force that invaded Ukraine in 2022. It is a demoralized, poorly led institution where survival has replaced mission as the primary objective. The officer corps, once the reliable backbone of the Putin system, is increasingly disillusioned, with reports of commanders demanding transfers to the rear and units refusing combat orders becoming too frequent to dismiss as isolated incidents. How this internal decay reached its current state traces back to fundamental failures in Russian military doctrine and leadership. The reliance on attritional tactics, throwing waves of poorly trained mobilized soldiers against prepared Ukrainian defenses, has produced casualties on a scale Russia has not experienced since the Second World War. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates Russian losses at approximately 1.2 million personnel since February 2022, including up to 325,000 killed. These are not abstract statistics. They represent specific units destroyed and reformed multiple times, veterans replaced with conscripts who have neither the training nor the motivation of their predecessors. The quality of recruits has plummeted, with military recruiters now targeting the most socially vulnerable segments of society, the poor, ethnic minorities, and residents of economically depressed regions, to meet quotas that become harder to fill with each passing month. The command structure's response to this crisis has been counterproductively brutal. Reports from the front lines describe officers maintaining discipline through fear rather than inspiration, with soldiers facing severe punishment for the slightest infractions. Soldiers who follow orders only to avoid punishment will not fight with the initiative and determination required to overcome determined opposition. They will seek any opportunity to surrender, desert, or simply avoid contact with the enemy. Ukrainian forces have noted a marked increase in Russian soldiers surrendering when the opportunity presents, a trend that reflects collapsing morale rather than tactical circumstances. The economic dimension of this unraveling is equally critical and increasingly impossible to conceal from the Russian public. Former central bank advisor Alexandra Prokopenko describes Russia's economy as having entered a death zone, metabolizing its own muscle tissue to maintain basic functions. The defense sector continues to receive priority funding, but the civilian economy that sustains ordinary Russians is left to deteriorate. Manufacturing outside the military-industrial complex is contracting. Small businesses, the backbone of local economies in provincial Russia, are closing at rates 15% higher than before the war. Inflation erodes wages and savings, while tax increases, including the VAT hike to 22%, extract ever more from households that have less to give. The social contract that sustained Putin for 2 decades has fundamentally broken. That contract traded political submission for gradually improving living standards and stability. Russians accepted the absence of democratic freedoms in exchange for predictability and the sense that, however imperfect their system, life was getting better. That bargain no longer holds. Living standards are falling, not rising. The demographic catastrophe unfolding across Russia compounds every other challenge. The war has killed or permanently disabled hundreds of thousands of young men, removing them from the workforce, from families, from communities. Birth rates, already low by global standards, have fallen further as uncertainty about the future discourages family formation. Emigration has removed hundreds of thousands of the most educated, most mobile, most globally connected Russians, primarily from major cities. Those who remain are disproportionately older, poorer, and more dependent on state support, exactly the demographic most vulnerable to economic shocks and least able to adapt to changing circumstances. The long-term implications for Russia's economic potential, its social fabric, and its ability to recover from the current crisis are profound and almost entirely negative. The international dimension of Russia's internal crisis continues to evolve in ways that compound Moscow's problems. India's reduction in crude purchases, driven by U.S. pressure and the practical difficulties of payment, removes one of the last major markets for Russian oil. China continues buying but negotiates harder terms, extracting deeper discounts and insisting on payment in yuan rather than rubles, a currency shift that reduces Russia's financial flexibility. The European Union, despite political divisions, maintains sanctions and has closed major loopholes, including the ban on refined fuel imports that took full effect in January 2026. The reaction of Russia's immediate neighbors is particularly significant. Finland, which joined NATO in direct response to the invasion, has permanently closed its border with Russia, ending decades of cross-border movement and trade. The Baltic states have become frontline defenders of NATO's eastern flank, hosting increased allied forces and conducting regular military exercises. Poland has emerged as Ukraine's most steadfast supporter, providing military aid, hosting refugees, and serving as the primary logistics hub for Western weapons. These countries watch Russia's internal deterioration with deep concern, understanding that a weakened Russia may be unpredictable and that instability in a nuclear power is as dangerous as aggression. Expert analysis from multiple institutions converges on several critical observations about the current situation. The Atlantic Council notes that while Russia faces severe pressures, there is little evidence of imminent regime collapse. The barriers to any rapid transition remain formidable. Putin has systematically eliminated potential rivals, centralized power in his own hands, and ensured that no alternative power centers exist that could challenge him. The security services, whatever their internal frustrations, have no incentive to support change that could threaten their privileges or expose them to accountability for war crimes. The population, however weary of war, has no organized opposition to rally behind and no clear vision of what a post-Putin Russia might look like. Political scientist Alexander Liebman of the Free University of Berlin argues that the regime's greatest strength remains its opponent's weakness. Russian civil society has been systematically dismantled over 2 decades. Independent media exists only in exile. Opposition politicians are either in prison, in exile, or dead. The few remaining critical voices operate at immense personal risk and reach limited audiences. Under these conditions, even widespread discontent struggles to find political expression. People may complain privately, may share dark jokes about the situation, may hope for change, but they lack the collective organizations, the trusted information sources, and the focal points for action that could transform private dissatisfaction into public demand for change. The military situation on the ground in Ukraine adds another layer of pressure. Ukrainian forces continue to exploit Russian weaknesses, launching counterattacks where enemy troops are cut off from supplies and communication. The liberation of approximately 169 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory since the 1st of January 2026 demonstrates that Russia's hold on occupied areas is not as secure as Moscow claims. The economic pressures bearing down on Russia are now intersecting with military realities in ways that create cascading effects. Reduced oil revenues mean less money for defense procurement, for soldier salaries, for the bonuses and hazard pay that have partially compensated for the dangers of frontline service. As compensation becomes less reliable and less valuable due to inflation, the already fragile motivation of Russian troops erodes further. Units that were held together by the promise of substantial payments may fragment when those payments fail to materialize or by far less than promised. The regime faces a cruel choice: cut military spending and risk frontline collapse, or cut social spending and risk domestic unrest. Either option carries existential political risk. The information environment within Russia, while still heavily controlled, shows signs of strain. The war's prominence in state media has actually declined, with the Levada Center finding that attention to events in Ukraine has fallen to its lowest recorded level. Only 45% of Russians now closely follow the war, a drop of 14 percentage points since May 2025. This could reflect either war fatigue, people simply cannot bear to engage with the topic, or a conscious turn away from propaganda that has become too dissonant with lived experience. People may know that the official narrative does not match reality and choose to disengage rather than confront the contradiction. Either interpretation spells trouble for a regime that relies on public attention to maintain the war's legitimacy. The international financial system continues to tighten around Russia in ways that even creative evasion cannot fully circumvent. The G7 price cap on oil, though imperfectly enforced, has forced Russia to sell at substantial discounts, directly reducing revenue. Secondary sanctions targeting banks and companies that facilitate sanctions evasion have made transactions increasingly difficult. The volume of Russian oil held in floating storage tankers at sea with no confirmed buyers has reached record levels, indicating that finding willing purchasers is becoming harder. Each month of continued war brings new restrictions, new enforcement mechanisms, and new adaptations that become harder to sustain. What could happen next in this deteriorating situation is constrained by several structural realities. The first is the winter season, which continues to impose severe costs on Russian forces while Ukrainian troops, better supplied and supported, wait in prepared positions. The second is the oil revenue timeline. If production cuts become unavoidable, the fiscal impact will be felt within months, forcing difficult budget decisions. The third is the mobilization question. Reports suggest the Kremlin is considering a new wave of conscription, a move that would be deeply unpopular and could trigger the kind of public resistance seen in autumn 2022 when partial mobilization was announced. The fourth is elite dynamics. Should economic pressures begin affecting the security services and military command directly through salary delays, benefit cuts, or perceived mismanagement, the loyalty that has thus far held may begin to fray. The international community watches these developments with an attention that has only intensified as the crisis deepens. For Ukraine's allies, the question is how to support Ukrainian resistance while managing the risks of Russian instability. For China, the question is how to protect its strategic investment in Russia without becoming entangled in Moscow's collapse. For Europe, the question is how to prepare for potential refugee flows, energy market disruptions, and security challenges that could accompany Russian disintegration. For the United States, the question is how to maintain pressure on Moscow while keeping open channels for crisis communication should the worst occur. No one, including the most experienced Russia watchers, can predict with confidence how this will unfold. The range of possible outcomes extends from managed decline, continuing indefinitely, through sudden collapse triggered by some unpredictable event, to a desperate lashing out that escalates the conflict in ways that draw in outside powers. What is clear is that the system Vladimir Putin built over 25 years is under stress unlike anything it has faced before. The combination of military stalemate, economic contraction, social exhaustion, and international isolation has created pressures that no adaptation can fully relieve. The question is not whether change will come, but when, how, and at what cost to Russia and the world.